everyone paying the slightest attention to current global events realized that on October 7th of this year, the ongoing war in which I was recently uh, enlightened on one of a more proper term for this region is the North African Southwest Asian world realm. I know it's a mouthful. The Middle East is a construct of like white supremacy. They grouped a bunch of people together that didn't have similar interests as in a unipolar strategy. So um, the North African Southwest corridor, the ongoing war against settler colonialism reached another height. The governing body of the Gaza Strip, Hamas, initiated a violent attack on the state of Israel, killing approximately 1,400 settlers. Wrote this a couple of days ago that that number may have risen. I think October 7th, the numbers are in on that. This was followed by a military invasion of the Gaza Strip by Israeli forces, which has to date killed over 11,000 Palestinians, including over 700 children. Given the critical geopolitics, economics, and history of this area, this conflict could easily ignite a third world war. The primary purpose of this talk is to highlight some of the most real and relevant aspects of this crisis in light of the ongoing struggle for Black liberation and social justice in the U.S. We'll start with a historical overview of the Palestinian struggle, followed by a brief, which we're going to pivot from that. We're going to do a documentary reveal. We're having technical issues on that. Um, but honestly, I mean, we get Q&A. We can just talk about, we'll fill in the time on that and just talk about going off script here. If you in the struggle, like all my homies, like we're not doing good right now. It's like I had to. It was. It's wild that like in HD, you can watch people, you know, just like lose everything. And if you're a thinking, feeling person, it's like I don't see how like you can go about your day to day business. And you know, it's in times like these we need solidarity now more than ever. So um, we anticipate and hope that y'all share your views and insights on the matter. And I introduce you my mentor, Michael T. He's going to put on and do this presentation for y'all.
Sure. Question. Can we go live?
Yeah, everybody go live. Yeah, do your thing.
All right, free Palestine.
Yes,
Free Palestine. Yes. So sad what's going on. But we've got to show, as Vincent said, solidarity with our brothers and sisters. This is a worldwide struggle that we're involved in. Some don't see the connections, but part of our mission as activists and organizers is to show the connections between all of these struggles. You know, we're in a world where we have to focus on geopolitics, see how all of this plays into the whole world situation. I always like to quote Huey P. Newton from a piece he wrote in 1971, sort of introduced at Berkeley at a conference, where he talks about, he makes a framing of the world existing as a collection of communities, where you have a reactionary community running the whole world and a bunch of other communities dominated by the whole world. So we have to see all of this in the context of the whole world. And these are unprecedented times. But I want to give a brief historical overview. As you probably know, this Palestinian thing is very complex. It's a lot of moving parts. It goes back really to the ancient world, but we ain't got time or the energy to cover all of that. So I kind of pick up at the end of the 19th century with the Ottoman Empire that some of you may know about. But I just want to reiterate or introduce some new information, some people may not have heard. On October 7th, the 2,000 to 3,000 Palestinian fighters from various political organizations. We're getting from the commercial media that it's Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Yeah, Hamas is the governing body right now, nominally, of the Gaza Strip. We know the Israeli Zionists control it. But actually, according to the information that we've gotten, that uprising included not only Hamas, but several other Palestinian fighters, including the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the DELP, which is an acronym for the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which has been out a long time, and the PELP, which is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, among other groups. They're trying to give us the impression that it's just Hamas, because Hamas has been so vilified. And, like most organizations, they have their contradictions, but it wasn't just Hamas. That uprising represented a lot of liberation groups. To say Hamas is like saying the 2020 uprisings were just led by Black Lives Matter. We know right here in this room that there were many forces involved in that. So, and in doing so, staging that uprising, which was an unprecedented event, caught the world by surprise, even though there had been many uprisings, they were able to break an 18-year siege that had been on them. But just kind of going back to the events some of the major events that led up to this, we start with the Ottoman Empire. How many people, just by show of hands, have heard of the Ottoman Empire? Okay, all right. Yeah, this was a major empire. I wish we had some graphics. But going into the 20th century, this was a major empire in in West Asia, what they call the Middle East now. And we hear little about it, but it was one empire among many empires. There was the British Empire that was still in existence at the turn of the 20th century. There was a U.S. empire. There were several empires. The Tsar had an empire, Russia, which included a lot of the nations around Russia. So there was a struggle going on then among empires. And a lot of these empires were, had emerged in the ancient world and evolved through the feudal period and on into the 20th century. And it's important, to understand, again, what empire means, just a working definition. An empire is a major political unit or entity having a territory of great extent or a number of territories under its control, or people or states, where the dominating force controls both the politics and the economics. We can see that in the American Empire. It's important to also know what colonialism is. Not looking out here, most of you folks know what that is, but for those who might not be totally clear on that, a basic definition would be direct or indirect acquisition, domination, and exploitation of one territory by people from another territory. They either rule remotely or through native agents. Now, this describes much of what colonial domination, of how it exists in the world today. They're ruling through native agents. A power comes into a territory like, say, the Americas, or a better example would be the British Empire, where they went to so many countries, set up shop, and maintaining the British Empire, they controlled other countries from the crown. Now, there's another form of colonialism in which we live under that relates to Palestine, and that's settler colonialism, where a foreign power invades a territory like the Americas, sets up a permanent colony, and eventually a state. That's essentially what has happened in Palestine, and that's essentially what happened in the US. And it's hard to understand in many cases in the US because, especially probably for Black people, because, you know, we were brought here as a labor force. Now, in Africa, European powers came to that landmass and exploited those people, through native agents, from their remote locations in their, European countries. In the United States, we had Britain, do something similar, set up shop here in the Americas, along with some other colonial powers. But they, but what happened, and the British didn't necessarily do this, but some of the British surrogates that we know as the founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, any number of them that, are held in great reverence. Basically, they represented they at some point set up a permanent colony that became a state. And how did they do that, and why did they do that? Well, contrary to the official narrative, it wasn't that they were looking for freedom and justice, because, as you know, they were displacing the indigenous people. That was the crux of the colonialism. That was sheer colonialism that you see almost everywhere in the world. They came and set up a colony, permanent state, or permanent colony. And initially, they enslaved the indigenous people. A lot of people don't know that. It wasn't Africans who were first enslaved, it was the indigenous people. That didn't work out. Worked out a little more for the Spanish, but in Americas, in North America, the indigenous people, the slavery of the indigenous people didn't work out too well. So Africans were brought in, but it was still colonialism because they were displacing the original people, but they brought an African labor force in as part of the colony. So you see, the connection that we have to that. And all the other people who aren't Africans are caught up in it too, especially, those who came and settled. So much for that. Back to the Ottoman Empire. This was a large empire, also known as the Turkish Empire, that controlled much of Southeast Europe, West Africa, and North Africa. That was between the 13th century and the early 20th century. Let's see. It came under Palestine came under the rule of the Ottoman Empire in 1516. And at that time, it included what we know now as the current state of Israel and present-day Palestine. Now, present-day Palestine is recognized by 235 countries as Palestine today. We're talking about 16,000 square kilometers of two non-contiguous, unconnected geographical areas. We've heard about Gaza and the West Bank. Before October 7th, 2023, there were 5 million Palestinians living in Palestine and about 6 million scattered throughout the world. Probably a lot less now, because the last count I heard, I think Vincent mentioned about like 11,000 Palestinians have been killed, probably more. Now, it's important to know that Zionism, which the commercial press is trying to conflate with anti-Semitism, is not the same thing. But that began as a political not a religious movement. That's important to know because a lot of that stuff is confused, because of, the Christian narrative and other things and conscious disinformation. But Zionism was orchestrated mostly by non-religious people who claim, Jewish ancestry. Because, people come to Judaism, just like a lot of different religious views, not necessarily out of some kind of biological lineage, but they convert. And many Europeans converted to Judaism. And there were many Europeans and non-Europeans who thought that the persecuted Jewish population throughout Europe needed their own nation. So Zionism is a form of nationalism. In my view, one of the pitfalls of nationalism, all types of nationalism, because it always winds up at the end of the day, even some of the most progressive nationalism, as us against them, our people against your people, and usually based on artificially constructed borders. And I was just at the events that we went on an environmental bus tour yesterday, in which the gentleman was pointing out how who conducted it that when you look at all these various borders, they mean nothing in the real world. From in space, you can't even see them, right? And in the environmental context, I mean, all the emissions that we're facing, what do borders? How do borders stop any of that? The sky is seamless. And really, the earth is seamless. So just keep in mind that a lot of these borders, it's all artificial. Now, Palestine, Zionism emerged as a reaction to centuries of persecution, which I said. And that persecution, quiet as it's kept, as much as they try to play up the antagonisms between the Islamic peoples and the Jewish peoples, most of the historical antagonisms with the Jewish people, I'm going to throw this out to the group. Who do you think that was with? Yeah, but religiously. Huh? Christians. If you go and study this historically, you say most antagonism that the Jewish people had was with Christians. If anybody knows about the Inquisition, that was the Christian Inquisition, where they were persecuting Jews. Islamic people didn't put them through no Inquisition. So you see where Zionism was very much supported by Christians. Now, Palestine, the area that was originally Palestine, was captured by the British, who played a key role in this, during World War I. And in 1922, the Ottoman Empire was officially dismantled. There's no more Ottoman Empire. You look on the map now, the map is constantly changing. Nations have come out of existence and nations have come into existence. Okay. By the turn of the 20th century, the Zionist movement had allied with the British. So that's important to remember. Even before the US got involved, it was the British who promoted that. Even before capturing Palestine, Britain had issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which promised the Zionists a homeland in Palestine without conferring with the Palestinians. The Palestinians represented at that time 94% of the population. 94%. Now think about that in terms of North America, right? At the time that the North American nation state was established, what percentage would you think of the country was made up of red people in 1776? Anybody want to just take a guess at that?
What's the question?
The percentage of indigenous people in the country at the time of the founding of the United States. Remember, this didn't start out as the United States. You know, a lot of indigenous people called it Turtle Island, or they had other names for it. Um, but anyway,
It's probably close to the number that you said before.
yeah, they were the majority.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how when we talk about America, we don't even think about that there were people here, a whole lot of people that, you know, they say about 500 tribes. And then these settlers come and disregard all of those 500 tribes, just like in Palestine, and say, well, we're going to set up a state. We're going to disregard whatever you had here before. We got a state, and now this is the United States. How arrogant is that? You know, but the late historian, before I get there, let's go back to the Balfour Declaration. In the Balfour Declaration, the Palestinians were referred to as the existing non-Jewish population. That's it. The late historian Patrick Wolf says that settler colonies are premised on the elimination of the indigenous people. Colonizers come to stay, and it's a system based on the expropriation and exploitation of a people. It's a structure, not an event. The British viewed Zionism as a way to secure their political and economic interests in the Middle East, much like the United States views it. Particularly its relationship to the trading routes through the Suez Canal in Egypt. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George was a strident Christian nationalist, by the way. But it's always important to recognize the material basis of these things. You know, don't let people, you know, like couch all of this stuff in purely religious things, because as quiet as it's kept, even most religious conflicts are mostly political. You know, the religion is just a facade in many ways. These people are out for power and resources for the most part, all religions. Now, there was after World War I, there was the short-lived League of Nations that was established at the end of that war. Now, out of that came a mandate offering exclusive rights of Jews to settle in Palestine. Again, this is in the context of, you know, persecution that's happening, which we don't want to minimize, of Jewish people throughout Europe. Throughout Europe. Most of that persecution was happening throughout Europe, not mostly Islamic people killing them or people in the Middle East. It was mostly anti-Semitic Europeans doing this. And there was a lot of that in this country, as quiet as it's kept. Okay, so there was Article 22, which they called the Covenant of the League of Nations, which recognized various independent nations in the area under that covenant, except Palestine. In the 1930s, as European Jews fleeing rising Nazi persecution sought refuge in Palestine, a Zionist paramilitary organization called the Irgun, may have heard about this, was formed. They advocated that every professed Jew, quote, had the right to return to Palestine, which they called Israel. They started introducing that concept. And think of it again like the colonists here saying, now this is the United States. There was no United States going on here before 1776. They declared that they had the right to violently oppose those who opposed that right. Thus, acts of terrorism were committed against both Arabs and the British. In 1936 alone, Irgun members carried out approximately 10 attacks against indigenous communities, and by the end of World War II, they had murdered more than 250 people. Under the British mandate, Egypt maintained control of the Gaza Strip, and Jordan controlled the West Bank. This is how this evolved. Eventually, through war, Israel seized control of both territories. Between 1936 and 1939, there were massive rebellions in Palestine, and the Palestinians were able to liberate a few areas. Subsequently, the British employed over 100,000 troops to repress this. They killed, wounded, deported, and imprisoned more than 10% of the adult male population. One in every adult male was imprisoned. And in 1948, a civil war broke out, which resulted in the what the Arabs called the Nakba, the catastrophe. Right? That's when you know, there was a qualitative change in the area. This was the loss of Palestine and the displacement and persecution of the Palestinians' country. Over 500 Palestinian villages were destroyed by Zionist militias and later the Israeli army once they formed the state. The Palestinians suffered geographic erasure. The land was erased, far as recognition, denial of the right of return, which all Jews have to Israel. It is one of the few countries where Jewish people have dual citizenship. Any Jewish person in the world claiming to be Jewish can return to Israel. And whether they originated there or not. And the land came under the control of the state of Israel. Eventually, it rose. Now, originally, at that time, 59%. Remember, people had been displaced. Of the land came under the control of the new state of Israel. Eventually, it was 79% in 2000. And 200,000 Palestinians took refuge in other places. Thereafter, the U.S. and Israel formed an alliance. The British are handing it over now to counter the Soviet influence in the region. So this is where the geopolitics comes in. Unlike the media is trying to tell us, this is just for Israelis, those terroristic Hamas and Palestinians. First of all, that's not good characterization of any of that. But they don't really give you good clarity as to all of the other surrounding countries that are involved in this and globally, because they don't want you to see how all of that connects and how we should all be in solidarity with them. Because again, the U.S. and Israel formed an alliance to stop the Soviet Union. Where have we heard that story before? Both Israel and the U.S. became primary nation-state supporters at that same time of a settler regime in Africa called South Africa. And the Israel joined with them. Many of you remember probably the African National Congress when Nelson Mandela was the leader. Their opposition was funded in large part by the Israelis. Anyway, moving on. Almost finished here. Yes.
The U.S. and Israel alliance, or like the beginnings of that, is that before World War II or during?
After World War II, the British pretty much were the leading colonial power in the area before that.
Thank you.
And another reason, that you didn't see, the U.S. involved in a lot of that or upholding the rights of Jews or anybody else is because this country, much as they're crying the blues now about all the so-called anti-Semitism that they're conflating with anti-Zionism, is that there's always been a lot of anti-Semitism in this country. And any Jewish person knows this. There's always been that. But how often do you hear that on the news? Yes, they're making it look like all of this just happened. The anti-Zionist demonstrations are indication of how anti-Semitic this country is. No, here's a good indication of how anti-Semitic the country is. In World War II, when the Nazis were implementing their final solution in Germany, there was a boat of Jewish people who came to seek asylum and refuge in the United States. They were turned away by the United States government, in large part because there were so many people here who did not want any Jews here, just like they don't want some of these other immigrants here. But it shows you how strong that was in this country. So don't believe this stuff that this country always loved the Jewish people. They see Israel as a strategic area to promote U.S. imperialist interests in the Middle East. As long as Israel's there, that's an outpost for them to shoot rockets and take arms and control that whole area. And of course, there's a lot of oil there, which is another big material interest. So, just coming down the stretch, another war broke out in the area in 1967. I remember that. I was 13 years old, in which new radical Palestinian leadership emerged. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, which was an alliance of various groups under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. Arafat was the leader of one particular group in that alliance called Fatah. But the PLO opened missions in 140 countries. Now, this is how they were able to globalize their movement. There's a lot to learn from this. Even though they were scattered and forced out of their homeland, wherever they went, they promoted their struggle. They were in Russia, they were promoting Palestinian liberation. They were in the United States, they were promoting Palestinian liberation. South America, Palestinian liberation. And you can see the culminating effect in that. This didn't just pop up overnight. The Palestinians had laid the groundwork all across the world. And now, there are many struggles going on, but we can arguably say that right now, Palestine is the epicenter. Just like a few years ago, Louisville was the epicenter, or at least one of the epicenters of the world movement against oppression and colonization, in the sense, just like Minnesota. The whole world eyes were on Louisville. Now everybody's looking at the Palestinians. It's a similar struggle, not identical, but very similar. So it was during that 67 war that Israel attacked Egypt and Syria at the behest of the U.S. to defeat a growing socialist movements in those countries, Egypt and Syria. The U.S. actually wanted to do it, but in 1967, they were bogged down in Vietnam. That was the height of the Vietnam War. So they couldn't do it. So they got their surrogate, the U.S., to carry that out. Yes. What did I say? U.S. and Israel, yes. And during that time, Israel seized control of the West Bank and Gaza. That's when they actually got that. This conflict led to UN Resolution 242, which didn't resolve the issue. You hear that evoked a lot, UN Resolution 242. But a lot of observers of that think that actually the Palestinians got tricked into thinking that was going to resolve it. Even Yasser Arafat, because, when they did that, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Let's go back to 1971. Jordan expelled all Palestinians from their country at the behest of Israel. And the U.S. at this time took the position that if the adjacent Arab countries refused to suppress Palestinian resistance, they would be ripe for attack by the Zionist entity. And that's where you see a lot of these wars, where they're attacking Lebanon and some of these other countries, because, they have given aid and refuge to the Palestinians. Now, another key moment was the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. Until the Iranian Revolution, which occurred at that time, Iran was under the rule of the Shah, was a major ally of both Israel and the US. With the seizure of power by the Islamic radicals in 1979, some of you may remember that, a number of US hostages were taken. The balance of power in the region shifted as Iran became a political ally of the Palestinians and an enemy of both countries. You see how that changed? With the demise of the Shah, the whole picture in Iran changed. Between 1991 and 1993, negotiations began between Israel and the PLO, culminating in the Oslo Accords. This is when Clinton was the president. He supposedly brokered this. It was aimed supposedly at resolving the conflict. A lot of people feel that all it did was manage it. Palestinians got cheated, and the accords didn't bring peace. And that's why we don't have it today. Complicating matters even more has been the complicity of many of these Arab states with global Zionism. I mean, many who were arch enemies of the Zionists have, the last few years made deals with not only the Zionists, but the U.S. imperialism like Saudi Arabia. And a lot of that's because they're dependent on U.S. foreign oil, like Egypt, or foreign aid, I should say. Okay, I'm going to deal with, we have to deal with this 9/11, which probably most of you remember. That was another major turning point that's connected to all of this, because we know that the U.S. imperialism used that attack, however we think it unfolded. We got 9/11 truthers who think it was an inside job, and those who think that the U.S. imperialists allowed that to happen. I tend to fall into that camp. But however it happened, we agree that it was used as an excuse for further U.S. intervention in the area, specifically to overthrow the Saddam Hussein regime, which Israel was opposed to. Hussein, for all of his problems, was arch enemy of Israel, and to dethrone the Afghanistan government. Even though it was found out that not only did Saddam Hussein have no weapons of mass destruction, he was not allied with Al-Qaeda, who orchestrated the 9/11 attacks. And as a matter of fact, Al-Qaeda, a lot of those groups didn't even like Hussein. And but it did give them an excuse to further intervene, get rid of one of Israel's enemies, and further, intervene into the Middle East. Now, I'm going to conclude here. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff involved in this. I mean, you can spend hours and hours and days talking about Palestine. But I think, some of the basic things, are important to know. And I encourage everybody, given the importance of this, to do some further research. But I'm going to conclude with a little overview of Hamas, since everything's being blamed on Hamas, even though, and you should Google this, it wasn't just Hamas involved in this. But anyway, since Hamas is the nominal leader of the Gaza Strip, it's important to know who they are. Now, that Hamas is an acronym that stands for the Islamic Resistance Movement. It was founded by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was a Palestinian cleric who had studied in Egypt and was an active member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Yassin established Hamas in December of 1987. After the outbreak of the first Intifada, which is an Arabic term for uprising, that's when it was founded. Recognizing that the Oslo Accords severely limited Palestinian self-government, and it wasn't the solution that they thought it would be, 2004, Yassin, their founder, was killed by Israeli forces. So keep that in mind. All right, they're so bad. It's important to know that despite Israel's opposition to Hamas, especially its propensity to commit acts of terrorism, Israel initially supported Hamas as a way of dividing the Palestinian liberation movement and thwarting the PLO. And that's important because see, they're hiding that fact. The Israelis, when the PLO was trying to negotiate with them, the Israelis did not want to deal with Yasser Arafat in any kind of constructive way. So again, you had other liberation movements. So the Zionists made a calculation that we'll support Hamas to divide this movement, since there were differences, just like you have in all movements. They're usually never uniform. Imagine the U.S. government came out and said, "Well, we think the Nation of Islam is the leading liberation group here that represents all Black people." Not all Black people would go for that. And we know that it's more that the Nation of Islam is not the only group that represents us. So why would an imperialist power be emphasizing that they're against liberation, period? They're against self-determination, period. Why would they be picking out and choosing different groups to initially support? Now, the irony of all of that is just like with Al Qaeda, that the U.S. supported initially in its struggle against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. They promoted that entity to thwart the Soviet Union. They turned against them. The Frankenstein monster, the monster that Frankenstein U.S. imperialism had built turned against them, just like Hamas turned against them. And they thought that that would keep the Palestinians divided. But actually what we're finding is that they're uniting the entire Palestinian world and all of their allies. Now, it's at a big cost, but we got to stand with them. Israel pulled out of the Gaza, but still maintained control of both the West Bank and Gaza's airspace, economy, and border. So they had no control at all. And yet you'll hear the commercial media talking about, yes, the Palestinians got their own space. I don't know what they're mad about. If another country is controlling your airspace, you notice that the Hamas has no planes to fly because they had to use these hang gliders because the Israelis won't let them control their airspace and their border. Anything coming in and out has to be controlled by Israel. Again, I'm coming down the stretch. In 2005, Israel implemented a blockade of Gaza. This is when they were seeing that Hamas wasn't playing with them. The next year, elections were held in Gaza. Hamas won. Opposed to the outcome of free elections, Israel and the U.S. conspired to overthrow them and promoting Fatah, which is part of the PLO alliance, one group in that. You may remember they had a violent battle of Fatah and Hamas, in which Hamas won. And they got nominal control of the Gaza Strip, and Fatah and the PLO maintained nominal control of the West Bank. This is after Israel pulled its forces out of the Gaza, but still remained controlled. There were several intifadas during the Obama presidency, during which 20 kilotons of explosives were used against the Palestinians. We can see there's much more now. So I think I'm going to stop there and open it up to any questions or comments, and we can have a discussion about some of this. Now, I know we have some folks who are just as well versed on this as I am with war. Feel free to offer your comments, because when it didn't make any provisions for the Palestinians. I mean, as I pointed out earlier, in that Balfour Declaration, they classified the Palestinians as merely the how did I say it? Forgot what it was. The non-Jewish, the existing non-Jewish population. I mean, what kind of designation is that? But no more questions. I thank everybody for coming up. And you want to say some closing words here, Vincent?
Thank you.
Thank you.
And y'all struggle continues. I got the email, send that video. Hey, everybody in this room, we know what time it is, man. And we see these images, like, they keep feeling people of this world, and we have an obligation, you know, like our people, man. It's TLC got a song, What About Your Friends? Real talk. So now's the time where this is a litmus test. Angela Davis said that the other day. It's a litmus test, man. What side are you on? So if you ain't talking about all that other stuff, and you don't have no room in your heart for this, man, don't leave me alone. I don't want to fool with you. So the struggle continues. Thank y'all, and free Palestine.
Right.